in this episode of the Critical Oxygen podcast.
It's so nuanced, and people need to be able to think critically and logically and as individuals, like understand the big picture concept, and then who am I? How does this apply to me and the event or the goal, that I have?
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Critical Oxygen podcast, where we help you optimize your physiology and maximize your athletic potential. I'm your host, Phil Batterson, and today we're joined by Coach Michelle Simmons. Michelle is the head coach of Team BSC Triathlon, where she works with triathletes of all ages, helping each individual reach their full athletic potential. Michelle, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Phil.
Yeah, it's so Michelle reached out to me actually on Instagram after listening, I think, to one of the episodes with a really interesting question that we'll touch on a little bit later because we're going to dive into some physiology. But she introduced herself and she was like, "Oh yeah, I've been essentially doing triathlons, and I don't mean to make this sound like you're getting older, but since I was 3 years old." So so I was like, "Oh my gosh!" Like she probably knows more, about triathlon and other things like that than, I could probably put into my lifetime. So the first thing that I want to do, because I really want to take advantage of all of your knowledge and wisdom here, is let's just get started with a brief introduction of your athletic background and then how you got into coaching and what you're doing now.
Sure. So I grew up, I've been an athlete my whole life. I was a gymnast for a long time, from a little kid. And then I started swimming in, middle school and high school, and even through college. I was actually a springboard diver in college, but I swam on the side with a master's team, mostly because I really liked it. And while I was swimming masters, but this is 1995, right? So like the internet isn't real. Were you born yet?
Yeah. No, it's I was 3 years old and I had no idea what the internet was or anything because it wasn't even there.
Right. So I'm lucky enough to not have had the internet when I was in high school, which is probably a blessing. But yeah, so the internet wasn't a thing. Triathlon was such a fringe sport, right? Back in 1995. And so to meet somebody who was a triathlete, it was like, what is that? What do you do? Right? Like we didn't know anything about it. And so yeah, I met a boy. He was like, "You're athletic. Let's get you a bike." And I'm like, "Okay." And he knew what he was doing, but sort of, but genuinely, like none of us knew what we were doing because in 1995, there's not coaches. We were, I grew up swimming. We would do, 2-hour practices. We'd swim 7 or 8K. We wouldn't eat anything, no water bottles on the deck. Then we'd go out afterward and just gorge on pancakes. And, we just did not know how to do it. My first Ironman was in 1997. And again, no active.com, nothing like that. It was,
no
Ironman
Training Peaks to record all of your workouts. No,
I didn't have a Garmin. I didn't,
you had maybe like a Timex watch, right? To just record how long you did stuff.
And you know what? That Timex watch, that $50 watch lasted me 15 years.
I was going to say it probably is still running. Because I used to have one of those, and my dad did too. And it's they're great, right? You don't have to worry about the battery dying or anything like that. They do what they're supposed to.
That watch is incredible. Yeah. So my first Ironman was in 1997, where it was you had to find a computer and print out the application form, right, and write a check by hand, put it in the mail with a stamp. And people laugh. I'm like, I know I'm aging myself, but this is what it was like in the old days. Yeah. So yeah, so you do your first Ironman with just no idea. I had no clue the physiology, the energy systems that were required for that. It was I came out of the water in 55 minutes, with the top pros, because I'm just killing myself from the beginning. Look how fast I'm going. And then maybe 2 or 3 hours in, it got real.
Yeah.
Oh, this is hard. I stopped on the side of the road and had a peanut butter and jelly sandwich and a Sunny Delight with some butter cookies like that. It was what do we know? Nothing.
Yeah.
So, this is how I learned, and honestly, it was sort of exciting during that time because nobody knew anything. So we were all just learning as we go. So that's essentially how I learned, was show up with the group, hear what somebody had to say. And then you hear, maybe we should drink Gatorade instead of water. Huh? Why is that? I don't know. Somebody just said drink Gatorade instead of water. Okay. And then you try that and you're like, well, that works better. Yeah. So I feel so I started coaching in 2008. And honestly, looking back now at like what I knew when I started coaching was nothing as compared to what I know now, 15 years later. But even then, I knew more than anybody that I was working with,
Right.
right? So it's like it's always this hierarchy of, who knows more. I'm like, well, I didn't know that much, but I knew more than a lot of people.
Sorry about those technical difficulties, everybody. I just had to readjust the headphones and stuff like that. But Michelle was talking about how, essentially in order to be an expert in this day and age, right, you just got to be a step above, the next person. So how are you gathering like that information, and how are you gaining, that sort of stuff with, just conceivably almost no internet going, being around then?
Oh, I mean, it was really like just by experience, what worked, what didn't work, and then joining groups. So we would find our triathlon group. At the time, I was living in Arizona, and you'd find your group and who was the fastest person in the group and what did he do,
Mm-hmm,
right?
mm-hmm,
How was he eating? And like, okay, he eats more than us when he's riding, and then afterward he doesn't gorge himself,
mm-hmm,
versus the rest of us are like finishing an 80-mile ride and we're starving to death and then we just gorge ourselves,
mm-hmm.
right? And then you're like, is that the best way to do it? Maybe let's try it the way that that guy did it. And
Mm-hmm.
then so all of it was trial and error, all of it.
Yeah. It's interesting you say that, because I think that sort of mentality still exists within like the endurance world in general. Like, for example, most of the time, the people or the coaches that I see that get a lot of gravitation towards them are ones that were really successful in their careers. And I think, it's sometimes things like, things that these elites are doing are what we should be emulating, but other times it's almost like they're good despite, not training, like the absolute correct way or the optimal way for some people.
Yeah, very much so. And some of them, or not even some of them, all of them, like if you're a professional, and I feel like this is something that I have learned as a coach, the difference between a professional athlete and an amateur athlete. And like the
Mm-hmm.
ones that, so I work with amateurs,
Yeah.
and the vast majority of triathletes are amateurs. And when we go on podcasts and we hear about the professionals and what they're doing, right? It's so easy to be like, well, his easy pace is 7:30, right? Like when he's out running,
Mm-hmm.
and but for him, like when as an exercise physiologist, you understand thresholds, as now do I, right? So
Mm-hmm.
like 15 years ago I didn't, but now I do. And so I'm like, but what his body, like the way that his body is converting energy for that 7:30 pace for him is not the same as the way that your body is converting energy for that, even for you, 8:30 pace, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like it's, and so that those concepts are so hard to communicate to amateur athletes in a
Yep.
way that they understand. What is the first threshold? What is the second threshold? I've heard you talk on this podcast before about how people don't understand the first threshold, and I would agree with you
Mm-hmm.
wholeheartedly. I mean, it was only probably 2 years ago that I understood first threshold. Like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, there's a first one? Tell me more.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I think, it's good to see these concepts that are from research coming and making their way into, like the endurance community. But something that's interesting is like a lot of the times it's sometimes flipped. So I mean, we've had coaches in the past who have identified that doing a lot of volume is really effective for improving, your endurance performance, right? And I think now we're just making that connection between, okay, well, that volume has to be at a low enough intensity that we can do it over and over and over and over without accumulating so much fatigue that we get injured or have to take too many rest days, or it, keeps us from continuing to progress. So it's good. And one of the limitations of research right now is that there's been a lot of work done at like second threshold, which I'm sure, you prescribe tempo workouts for your athletes and other things like that. There's tons and tons and tons of data out there that's like, oh, this is what you can do to improve your second threshold. This is how it improves your second threshold. But there's a lot less data on first threshold, and it will take probably 10 or 20 years for the research to catch up and start to do these, research, or, these studies, and really see. And I mean, we know, for example, like that zone 2 training is really good for mitochondrial volume and capillary density, right? That's what everybody says. um, but in all actuality, a lot of the times those research studies aren't quite as low as zone 2 would be for somebody who's actually trying to do it on a regular basis. Normally, that like moderate intensity training is at like 70% of your VO2 max, maybe a little bit higher, which I think for a lot of us is going to be over that second threshold and kind of into that like gray zone or sweet spot or whatever you want to call it, sort of training. So it's still accumulating a decent amount of fatigue. But now I think people are realizing, oh, I can actually start to go a little bit easier, especially for these super long endurance events like ultra marathons, Ironmans, half Ironmans, even like marathons. I think I would put a little bit more in that camp as
Mm-hmm.
well.
And I mean, my experience, so I mean, interestingly, I'd say when I said I didn't know about the first threshold, that's not the same as saying I didn't understand the value of easy training,
Right.
right? I just didn't know that there was, this physiological a threshold, like the turning point at some
Mm-hmm.
point there. It was a matter of, and what's interesting is that the coach who taught me about like slow down, go easier, put the heart rate cap on, put in more volume at very, very easy. And it was frustrating at the time. So I'm like, I could go faster, and he's
Mm-hmm.
like, I know, keep it easy, go slower. And then you have this breakthrough season where you're like, when I
Mm-hmm.
actually go to race and you're like, oh my God, that worked. That was amazing how that worked. So like we didn't, and I don't know if my coach understood why it worked. He
Mm-hmm.
just knew that it worked. Right. So
Mm-hmm.
then I'm like, I didn't know why it worked. I just know that it works. So slow down, do a lot of it
Mm-hmm.
easier, go hard sometimes on purpose, and then let yourself race on race day. And that
Mm-hmm.
was like just this formula that seemed to work really well. And then it was, as the years go by, is when I start asking the questions like, why does that work? Tell me more. I'm curious and I
Yeah.
want to know why it works after knowing that it works.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a mark of a good coach, right? Is you were telling me that you identify patterns in how you prescribe exercise and then how that response is received by your athletes and then how they, perform. And then, now with all of these, podcasts that are coming out and science being shared on a larger scale than really has ever been shared before, it gives you then the tools of knowing the underlying why. I've always been the type of person who just wants to know why for everything. I don't just accept that I'm just going to go do, 20 by 400 for a, for a workout or something like that from my high school coaches. I'm like, well, why are we doing this? Because this seems like a lot of effort. And if you don't have a good reason for why I'm doing this, then that's not going to convince me to actually do it. I was a little bit, I wasn't challenging overtly. Like I didn't just like call my coaches out, but I would get like frustrated, be like, well, they can't tell me why, this is BS. I don't, sort of deal. And I think that's what stemmed me to get into the research side of things, is trying to figure out the why behind what we do. But yeah, so that was one of my questions was, how has training and coaching kind of changed throughout the years? And, it seems like it's an experiential sort of based thing. At least it was for you. So you got into triathlon. You're kind of just like, oh yeah, somebody told me that I was going to be good at triathlon. So I got a bike and then I started training, getting along with like the different camps. And then, you got a coach. And tell me more about the progression of your career, actually, your athletic career.
Sure. So I did, like I said, I did my first Ironman in 1995. I went on to do 17 more, so like
Mm-hmm.
18 total. I suspect at this point I'm likely done with triathlon. like we'll see. Like you never want to promise those things because I could come back and do one when I'm 60, but I
Mm-hmm.
feel like I've achieved what I've wanted to achieve. So I don't know that I'll like continue to do more. But what I would say for me, I coming from a swimming background, running was always hard for me. And so
Mm-hmm.
like, again, it's these patterns. And when you coach, you sort of see that like, okay, people who come from a swimming background, generally speaking, tend to have a harder time running
Mm-hmm.
versus people who have a harder time or who come from a running background tend to sink more when they go in the water.
Yep, I
Okay.
was going to ask
Um,
that.
yeah, I mean, so it's like, okay, there. So again, like when a new athlete comes to me and I'm like, tell
Mm-hmm.
me your background. If they come from one of those backgrounds, I have a little aha.
Mm-hmm.
Another pattern, just FYI, people who come from a swimming background tend to be I don't want to call them like better, but they tend to be easier to convince that they need to eat and fuel their work, versus people who come from a running background tend to be the ones that when I try to get them to eat more carbohydrate, like, okay, you want to do an Ironman, here's how many carbs you have to eat. And they will rebel on that and not want to do it. So I've really found that, okay, people who come from a swimming background, like, it won't be that hard to convince them, here's what you need to eat on the bike. They'll just get it.
Yeah.
So it's like those kinds of things. I think I hired my first coach in 2007. And from there, what I ended up doing, I saw coaches as my ability, as like my ticket to learning more. And so when I hired a coach, it wasn't just like, give me the program. It was really a matter of me using the coach to help me understand more, show me how you do this, and why. And so I would hire a coach sort of every 1 or 2 years. I would switch coaches, and not because the coach wasn't good enough, or like I was using the coach for a different purpose. And it was more about my own education than it was about my own performances, if that made sense. Like,
yeah.
So I probably had 6 or 7 different triathlon coaches over the years. So I used the different coaches to help me become a better coach. And it was, so part of it was going to be an education thing, help me understand why you're, programming the way that you are. And then it also helped me to be a coached athlete. I was able to see what kinds of like communication or, what's coming from that coach that's helping me, versus maybe there's things that the coach is doing or not doing that were not serving me or helping me do better. And that helped me form my own style. Right. And so I had a lot of different inputs and examples of like, what does a good coach look like? How does a good coach act and communicate and talk to their athletes? And so I think that really served me, having a whole bunch of different coaching influences. And then of course, Twitter. I mean, I've cultivated my Twitter feed so that it's just a lot of, and there's a lot of people like you out there, which is really cool. And it's like every time you guys post a podcast, a webinar, Steven Seiler's going to talk about something, like, I'm listening, Dr. Sam Milan talks about, I'm like, you're on, okay, cue it up. Like, and I'm taking notes, and I just use that as like, this is my continuing education. This is how I learn. I will say one of the ways that I learned the most in the last couple of years was, and I've heard you say, so I feel like this would be a good conversation for us, because I've heard you say, not a huge fan of lactate. I got a lactate meter a couple of years ago, and it was, so, and I don't use it a ton now, and I don't use it for like exercise prescription. But what I will say is I use it, or when I started using it, it helped me understand a big picture in a way, like it helped me understand that at certain intensities, my body's doing something different. Right? Because like you can test the lactate, like, so when I go really easy and then the lactate says this, and then I start working harder and the lactate says this, and then you start working really hard and the lactate says 12. And then it's like, I can coordinate how my body feels at the different like levels of lactate. And then that's really what helped me as an athlete understand like LT1 and LT2, and like, oh, you know what? Those are lower than I would have thought that they would have been if I just went by feel or by heart rate, so it gave me permission to slow my easy workouts down further, knowing that like, I thought it was easy, but my lactate's 2.3. Right. So like, it's not slower, as easy as it could be. So it's like having that. And again, so like, I don't use it every day. I did lend it out to some of my athletes, the local ones, to say like, here, and just gave them, like, we're not in a lab and it's not perfect. So, like we'd give a step test, but more along the lines of like, let's just see, like, are you, and what was really interesting is that like some people would like top out their lactate at 6 point something, right? Whereas I get mine up to 12. And that just shows that like, oh, okay, like we're different physiologically. And it's like, oh, okay. And then I'm go back and read about how like, well, maybe if I have a really high, and so just test me on this and tell me if I'm right or wrong. Cause like
Yeah.
this is my interpretation is like, okay, so for somebody like me who has a high glycolytic ability, if I'm training endurance, my easy days need to be even easier than say like an equivalent athlete who like isn't producing lactate or isn't that lactate isn't spilling over into their blood anyway
Mm-hmm.
until later. Their like easy can be a little bit quicker than mine. And that doesn't necessarily mean that on race day she beats me.
Mm-hmm.
It's just that the appropriate training for me is easier. And so,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I was using lactate along those lines.
Yeah.
Tell me your thoughts. I'm curious.
Yeah. No, there's a number of different things there. So I think I do sometimes get a little bit frustrated with lactate because coming from like the research background and knowing kind of like that 2 millimole, sort of threshold and the 4 millimole threshold, exactly like what you were saying, it isn't telling us exactly what we think it's telling us if it's too simplified. So for example, you top out at 12, somebody else might, I've had individuals who top out less than 4. So if you were giving a test and you were just assuming that 4 millimole was the second threshold and somebody never got to 4, you would either say, well, you didn't try hard enough, even though you could literally look over at the person, you could see that they're dying on the treadmill. Or you would say, oh, well, we just didn't get up to 4 millimole today, so you don't have a second threshold. But they do have a second threshold. It's just most likely that, their lactate, exactly like what you were saying, is not spilling over into the blood as much because of something internally, something from individually on their physiology that is actually not allowing them to have lactate spill out into the blood. So that could be because they are in a calorie deficit, right? They're not replenishing their carbohydrates. It could be because they're eating a lot of fat, right? If you're eating fat, you're going to preferentially burn fat. If you're eating more carbohydrates, you're going to preferentially burn more carbohydrates. And when you start to know where those are coming from, then oh, more carbohydrates probably lead to more lactate, right? They could also have very, very robust mitochondrial populations. They could, have higher amounts of mitochondria within their skeletal muscle, and they could be maybe a little bit more type 1 fiber dominant versus somebody else who's, having more lactate spill out into their blood, who might be a little bit more type 2 fiber dominate. You're still going to have a big proportion of type 1 fibers, so don't get that misconstrued, everybody who's listening. But it's the cool thing about these internal physiological variables is it allows you to get a calibration to how you're feeling and what your power output really is. And I remember listening to Olav Alexander Boo, who's the head coach of the Norwegian guys, and he was saying that they use things like lactate, things like NIRS devices to recalibrate their individuals, because some individuals, I think most of us, have a tendency to go too hard too often. So by showing them, hey, your lactate's super high today, or your SMO2 is super low, you need to back off because the purpose of this workout is to go easy. That gives you a way of then recalibrating what your perceived exertion is. Because on the course, if you lose your power meter, your GPS, your SMO2, your heart rate, if you lose any of that, what the heck are you going to do? You're going to have to go by feel. And that's a scary thought, I think, for a lot of us. But it is one of those things that I think everybody should try to get to a point where they're doing all of their work by feel, and then using those pieces of technology, those internal variables, to then check in, right? And let us know what is actually going on under the hood. So no, I think you hit it right on the head. Is like lactate. I think there's value in really anything that we can measure, as long as we are learning from it. And I think this is kind of going to be the trend of, or the topic of this show, is like, how can you continue to learn from really anything that you're doing? And there's things you can learn from lactate, there's things you can learn from heart rate, there's things you can learn from just training by power. But it's a matter of how do you take that and how do you apply it to yourself as an athlete, or if you're a coach, how do you apply it to other athletes and get the best outcome, from there.
Yeah. I, 100%. And I agree with everything that you said. And it took me longer than it would have taken you because I don't have like the educational background that you have. But in like when I had the athlete, because I had a similar athlete too, who like her lactate never hit 4. Like she
Mm-hmm.
never found a way to get to 4. I also know that that athlete, um, I'll say this as nicely as I can, but was afraid of carbohydrates.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so then so I'm looking at that going like, oh, this is like continuing evidence that she's under fueling herself. And that was my guess as to like why
Mm-hmm.
she couldn't get her lactate up. And again, I can't really prove that. It's just more of like understanding what lactate is and how we're creating it if you're
Mm-hmm.
not ingesting carbs. And the thing is, I did it a couple of times on myself because I just like to experiment on myself. And like, I bet you do too, right? Like when
Mm-hmm.
you have like some sort of a piece of equipment, but I would purposely be underfueled, or like when I knew I was underfueled, I would go and like try to do a workout and then test the lactate on that and be
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, well, when I'm underfueled, I can hit those same watts and my lactate is way lower
Mm-hmm.
than it would have been, when I was fully fueled. And like, well, that's interesting, but that's not the ideal. Like, that's not how we want to race. Right. So
Right.
like in one way you could look at it and say lactate's lower, but is that better?
Mm-hmm.
Well, like not if my goal is performance.
Right. And I think that's where people get it a little bit misconstrued. And this is like, so I work for Moxie Monitor, which is a near infrared spectroscopy company, and everybody wants a directionality. Oh, if my SMO2 is down on a certain day, does that mean I am better suited to perform on that day? Same thing with lactate, right? If my lactate is lower on that day, does that mean I am better suited to perform? And the answer is it depends, because there's a lot of different inputs that could be mediating those changes. And something that I've kind of come to the conclusion of as well, and I also want to touch on like this idea of runners eating more in just a second, but the when I run into athletes who are like, oh, I don't want to eat, oh, I don't want to do this, or like scared of a little bit of change, I always challenge them and say, well, are you trying to get better, or are you going to let this kind of get in the way? And why don't we just change it for 2 weeks and see how you feel? Because at the end of the day, 2 weeks in the grand scheme of things is nothing. If it doesn't work out for you, even a week, we can switch back to whatever it is that you were doing beforehand, and no harm, no foul, right? So that's something that I've started to learn, and I apply it to myself because I am a little hard-headed sometimes. So I'm like, okay, just change it for 2 weeks. See if you change it for 2 weeks, what happens. If it's terrible, just go back to what you were doing. It's almost as easy as that.
It seems like it should be.
Yeah.
And when you deal with like people in the real world, like if they have some sort of like, I mean, a lot of this fear of food stems from a childhood memory from 30 years ago. You
Mm-hmm.
know what I mean? So it is just not as easy as saying like, just eat more. You know what I mean?
Right.
For like, in theory, it should be, but it's not as easy as just eat more.
No, it's certainly not. And I don't mean to downplay, things like eating disorders and other things like that. I've had disordered eating and bad relationships with food, especially when I was a cross country runner. I made this connection that eating less would make me faster, because it did. But then
Mm-hmm.
I kept winding up with injuries because I wasn't rebuilding my house. I was taking bricks from the bottom of the foundation and just putting it on top of the Jenga stack. And eventually that Jenga stack would fall down. So I'm saying all this stuff out of a warning for people, is like, yes, you may not, like, I don't know, because I still struggle with it. And it's interesting that you say, runners have a tendency to be against it, because I was a runner growing up, and I think it's just the culture of running, right? We see all of these, super lightweight people who are just crushing it. And what I've kind of come to the conclusion of is like, those individuals are probably lighter and faster because of the work and the consistency that they've put in, rather than being light makes them faster, for example.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I work a lot with Ironman athletes.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing that's interesting, and like it's completely possible to gain weight during Ironman training.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen it, like I've done it, and then I've seen it with the athletes too. And I've figured out what it is I say we, but I'm not doing it anymore. But what anyone who's gaining weight during an Ironman or during training for an Ironman, it's because they think that they have weight to lose, right? So I'm going to use this long endurance training to burn more calories, and I'm going to be really disciplined, right? They're going to wake up on Saturday morning and be disciplined, and I'm not going to overeat during this 5-hour bike ride, that I'm going to do today. And so then they under fuel the work that they're doing, and then they finish. And even then they know they're supposed to eat something. So they'll eat like the smallest amount that they can and think like, okay, good. And then that night, they're absolutely starving, right? And then they're like, well, wait, I rode my bike for 80 miles today. So yeah, like we can go get pizza and we can have the ice cream and I earned that. And it's like, and then you wake up on Sunday morning and you're puffy and inflamed, right? Because you ate all those carbohydrates at a time when like your body could have used all of those appropriately.
Earlier.
Like, and so what I just preach absolutely nonstop to everyone is like, this fueling window, like when you're eating your carbohydrates, like eat them before you train, during your training, and after your training, like within that window. And then later, if you do that right, later you can eat like a normal person. Like you can have, your salads and your proteins and the chicken and all that. You don't need to indulge yourself on Saturday night if you did it right during the training. And that's like such an aha. And it's just the opposite of how many at least amateur athletes think about fueling their long distance training. And like when you starve yourself and then binge later, yeah, you're going to gain weight that way.
Yeah. I've been tracking my calories, and I'm working with a coach right now too, and trying to, build consistent habits and do other things like that. And so that's the exact conclusion I've come to, is that you need to fuel around training, because those are the times where you're most likely going to be burning the most amount of calories throughout the day. But after that, you need to eat like a normal person, because that is kind of like, we all think that doing all this exercise and stuff like that is going to, just like make us burn tons and tons and tons more calories. And the app that I use, I'm really liking it, because what they ask you is they say, okay, well, what do you weigh? And then they ask you like how active you are, and kind of give you like that estimation of, you probably burn, 3,000 calories a day. And, then from, like the workouts and stuff that you do, it's like, oh, well, if you actually like look at it, if you're biking hard for like an hour, you could burn, 5 to 1,000 calories, depending on what your power output is. But what this app does is it tells you, okay, this is how much you should aim to eat. And then you weigh yourself every single day, and it gives you trends of where your weight is going. And then it dials in how much food you should be eating from there. And since I started tracking, I went from 3,000 calories to 3,200 calories. I've maybe gained a pound or and a half. And that's probably because I'm eating more carbohydrates, and, carbohydrates hold on to more water. But it's one of those things where that was an aha moment, is like, when you exercise, you don't actually burn that many more calories comparatively to what you would normally be burning on a given day, because you're only exercising. Well, if you're an Ironman athlete, you might be exercising 4, 5, 6 hours, which then it gets into like, oh, you need to be fueling a lot during, like replenishing those carbohydrates and, those calories a lot during like the actual workout. But then afterwards, right, if you've appropriately eaten the entire time, then yeah, you can just go back to being a normal human being. You don't have to go out of your way to eat, like a whole pizza and other things like that, which I also used to do as well after really, really big days. So, yeah.
Yeah, I would agree with that. That's maybe one of the bigger struggles that I have as a coach with some athletes, just getting them to eat enough at the right times.
Yeah, the fueling is a big thing, and I think it comes down to, fuel for what you're going to do, like beforehand, an hour or two beforehand, fuel while you're doing it. And, there's some people who have gotten on the bandwagon of like fasted training and like other things like that. But I think for the vast majority, it just results in too much stress being accumulated. And for the most part, from a physiological standpoint, you're probably going to get the same amount of benefit, maybe just slightly smaller. It's marginal, right? The marginal gains in terms of like fasted work versus non-fasted work. And, then you're running into, deeper caloric deficit. So then you're playing catch up the entire day. So within
Yeah.
2 to 3 hours, eat, fuel during your workouts, and then, have your breakfast, right? Or, like whatever it is, you're kind of like post exercise, whether it's a shake or whatever it is, but enough that it's going to kind of make up for those burn calories, and then you just get on with your day.
Right. So clear this up for people. So I know that I have athletes that I work with, and I'm sure they are not the only ones who have I'll call it a misconception, but like if I'm wrong, let me know, because maybe I am. I don't think I am. But this misconception that if I just do this workout and I don't eat carbohydrates, then I'm more likely to be burning fat during that workout. And I'm like, that's not how it works. And like, unless, because my understanding is as long as you're going easy enough, then you can be burning more fat, or at least if you're working out more in the range of like a fat max. But if you get carried away, or you run into somebody and you start working harder or whatever, like just because you haven't fueled yourself with carbohydrate doesn't mean that your body doesn't want to use glucose to fuel that work. And your body's going to then make glucose or find it from somewhere, right? And then and there's an additional stress response. My gut feeling on this, and again, I don't have studies, but so help me understand, but my gut feeling is that when we go out and say, like, hypothetically, a 3-hour ride, that you fueled a little bit because you thought you were just going to go easy, and then you ended up going harder than you thought, caused this stress response, and now your glucose is higher because your body made it. That feels like something that's not great for us to do.
So it depends on who you ask and what researchers you look at, because if you like from just a pure definition, yes, you're probably going to burn more fat during that workout. If we'll just make it easier. Just say you did a fasted 3-hour bike ride, right? And you went a little bit harder. Your body is still going to be burning fat because you're probably not working out at your second threshold for 3 hours. That would not be the definition of second threshold. So you're still going to burn a large proportion of fat, but you're also going to be burning a large proportion of carbohydrates. This is another misconception that people have, is that, oh, I'm either burning fats or carbohydrates. Saying no. Unless you're sitting here, talking like Michelle and I are, or doing very, very light walking, that would be a time where you'd be burning almost 100% fat, maybe like really light cycling as well. And then it's a distribution all the way from that to your second threshold. When you hit your second threshold, that's when you're almost primarily burning carbohydrates. So you're going to be burning carbohydrates and fats at different proportions, from, like the time you start exercising to, like the super, super hard intensities. So from just a pure mathematical standpoint, yes, you would be burning more fats during a fasted workout. That it is what it is, because your body just doesn't have as much glucose to be able to burn. As soon as you eat something, your body preferentially, especially if it's high in carbohydrates, your body will preferentially burn that glucose. So essentially you'd be, sparing a little bit of your, say, muscle glycogen and your liver glycogen. You're still going to use a little bit of fat, but you're actually, you almost override the oxidation of fats in favor of that glucose oxidation. It's after your workout where you actually burn more fats, because you have to think about the reason why we burn fats or carbohydrates is to make enough ATP in order to keep bodily processes going. ATP is the energy currency of the cell. When you're at lower intensities, you don't have the stress response, the hormonal response that's going to cause more carbohydrate release. So you have the ability to then burn more fats. All in all, it's pretty much a wash in terms of if you're eating, if you're not. But I will say that if you do go out and do a fasted workout, and this is the point I wanted to make, you're going to be burning a lot of your muscle glycogen and your liver glycogen. Those are your stores of carbohydrate that are, both in your liver and in your muscle. Within your muscle, it's that muscle glycogen can only be used really for ATP regeneration, for muscle contraction, and maybe for a few other things within the muscle. The liver, though, is super important because that's what keeps your blood glucose at a certain level. And if we dip too low, then our brain can't actually get enough glucose, and that's when we start to have higher stress responses and other things like that. And that's where the bonk comes in. If you've heard of that, is when your liver glycogen starts to get low, your blood glucose starts to go down, and your brain doesn't like that. So your brain's like, whoa, we need to slow that down. And the easiest way to slow that down, especially during exercise, is get your muscles to stop contracting, because that's what's using the energy coming from glucose that's being broken down. So I don't know if that answered your question. That was a kind of a crash course in carbohydrate and fat oxidation. But I, at the end of the day, again, it's marginal, right? We take these studies and people are like, oh, fasted cardio burns more fat. Yeah, but if you're always depleting your muscle glycogen, you're not going to be able to exercise at as high of an intensity. You're probably going to create more of a stress response and more of an immune response. And that's when you see people who are both in a calorie deficit and trying to exercise really hard, they have a tendency to get sick more, get injured more, those sort of things. And that's most likely driven by the fact that you're turning over so much muscle glycogen and not refueling that you're putting just a lot of stress on your body that it can't recover from.
So people who don't eat enough carbohydrate is, does your body then make, because I know about like gluconeogenesis, like your body can make glucose.
Mm-hmm.
So hypothetically, like somebody who say they're like a keto athlete or whatever, is their body making glucose that acts as muscle glycogen? Or does it go into the muscles? I mean, is that how it works, or is that not?
That's a really good question. And I think there's not enough research out there that really kind of tells us what the long-term adaptive process is to a higher fat individual. There is evidence to suggest that you do a better job of holding on to like muscle glycogen and by being more reliant on fat. So what you would do is you would probably have more mitochondria with more machinery to burn the fats, because there's machinery that burns fats, and there's machinery that burns glucose. And if you have more machinery to burn the fats, then you can spare glucose and muscle glycogen for longer. And by doing that, then you can wait until you can tap into that carbohydrate. But at the end of the day, you still are, if you're a fat adapted athlete and you're not intaking glucose or carbohydrates, you're still going to be limited in how much muscle glycogen you have to start with, and then how much your body could actually oxidize during, whatever exercise it is. And we know it's like carbohydrate is the high octane fuel, for your muscles. You need it. So there's not much good evidence to actually show that fat oxidate or, becoming a fat adapted athlete is actually beneficial for exercise capacity, unless you're really like an ultra endurance athlete, I mean, maybe an Ironman, but I think you're still putting together pretty high power outputs during that, but maybe for like ultra marathon running and those sort of things.
Yeah. My understanding was that, so for athletes that are like, if your goal is to perform well at an Ironman, that it's really important to be, and this is how I frame it anyway. So like, hit me if I'm wrong. You want to be a hybrid athlete. Like you want a really good ability to burn fat, and you want a really good ability to burn glucose, because you need both. And if you don't have if you don't do enough easy training to develop the fat oxidation ability, then you're running on glucose all the time, and you'll end up walking on that marathon, because you will be reduced to, like, at some point, like the amount of glycogen that we have stored in our liver and muscles in combination with the amount of glycogen that we can like take in and absorb during, every hour, like the math doesn't add up. Like
Mm-mm.
like you will run out before you get to the finish line. So at least some of that, and I don't know what the proportions are, but
Mm-hmm.
at least some of it has to come from fat. And
Mm-hmm.
so that's why it's like we do enough easy training that you are developing this capacity for your body to do.
Mm-hmm.
And then also, but you're not depending fully on fat. It's like part of it comes from fat, part of it comes from
Yep.
glucose. You want both. And then here's another question for you. And I've asked several people, so maybe you don't, maybe there's not an answer. Nobody
Yeah.
knows. Nobody has answered it for me before. But I've heard this concept of like, okay, so like when we start working hard enough that our body is producing lactate,
Mm-hmm.
that if you have enough mitochondria before the lactate spills over into the blood, that lactate can be, I'll use the word recycled, but
Mm-hmm.
like turned into energy and your body uses it for energy.
Mm-hmm.
And then my question is like, okay, how much does that contribute? And like nobody's ever answered it.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know.
No, that's
Is that
that's a phenomenal question. That's like that really demonstrates like how much you've thought about this sort of stuff, because it is complicated. So the first question or the first statement you said is that athletes need to be hybrid athletes. I 100% agree with you, and this is why we do easy training and hard training. This is why we maybe do polarized training some parts of the year, pyramidal training some parts of the year, and we're changing up the training and progressing it, because all of those adaptations are meant, and this is me as a mitochondrial physiologist, kind of being a little mitochondrial centric, but it's all based on adapting or making your mitochondria more capable of utilizing fuel. Because if we have more robust functional mitochondrial populations, we're able to oxidize fat, because that's where fat is oxidized, is within the mitochondria. We're able to oxidize pyruvate, which is the last step in the breakdown of glucose, unless you make it into lactate. And both of those are super important for fatigue resistance, because what we see is that the mitochondria's capacity to use oxygen, because the mitochondria are the only place in your body that actually use oxygen, is highly, highly tied to your ability to stave off fatigue. And so by doing that easy training, right, you're giving your body the ability, or you're oxidizing fats, and it's really what your mitochondria are trying to do, or what your muscle is trying to do, is it's trying to just derive enough energy in order to keep contraction going. And it just so happens that during light intensity work, it's more beneficial for us to burn a higher proportion of fats. And we burn fats up until fat max, and then it starts to taper off. And the reason, or one of the thoughts, is that you're limited to fat oxidation at higher intensities of exercise, because the stress becomes so much that you actually close the capillary beds to your fat stores, and you can't get enough fat to your muscle. So your muscle doesn't even get enough fat. So you have to switch. That's part of it. So you have to switch away from fat to carbohydrate oxidation. And then on top of that, since you are contracting harder, you have to generate more ATP more quickly. So that also comes from the breakdown of glucose. So it's kind of a two-pronged thing, right? At the really low intensities, you have to train yourself to be efficient in that movement. And it's just so happens that you burn fat right at those intensities, and it does not cause as much fatigue accumulation, so then you can get more volume. Then on the flip side of things, it's been shown time and time again that, like one of the studies I did during my PhD, we looked at how your mitochondria adapt to 7 sessions of high intensity interval training over the course of 2 weeks, so every other day for 2 weeks. And really the only thing that changed was your mitochondrial function. So your mitochondria's ability to use oxygen with different substrates. And that increased like 20 or 30% in sedentary individuals. So you gain benefits from both, and it's across all substrates. So from fats to carbohydrates, it's a 20 or 30% increase with no changes to mitochondrial, say, volume, which is what's been shown to be associated with more exercise at lower intensities. So that's the first thing I'll say. And then what was the second portion of the question?
It's about how
Oh,
much lactate is contributing to like
mhm.
energy. Like I was like, how much? I don't know.
Yeah, a lot. So some people would say that the end product of glycolysis isn't actually pyruvate, it's lactate, because of just the chemical makeup of pyruvate and lactate and stuff. But we don't have a good way of actually measuring the amount of lactate that's being produced. We only know what's accumulating in the blood.
Right.
So like you were saying, right, so we have lactate producers, which are going to be more of our like fast twitch fibers that are a little bit more reliant on glucose breakdown, and those are going to be creating a lot of pyruvate. Pyruvate, if the mitochondria of that muscle can't take any more pyruvate up, is going to be converted into lactate. That lactate is going to seep into the the tissue next to it, and it's going to be taken up by the mitochondria of, say, slow twitch fibers. That lactate then gets converted back to pyruvate and then uptaken into the mitochondria, where it can go into the TCA cycle and get used or oxidized for the electrons that ultimately make more energy for us. So we don't have the ability to actually measure what's leaking into the different fibers. We just know how the balance is changing, and that's kind of the value of blood lactate, right? Is it tells us from a whole body perspective when lactate starts to accumulate within the blood. So if it's accumulating, we can say, oh, the production is higher than the consumption. Whereas if lactate was going down, say, you went really hard, and then you went down and started going really easy, you actually see lactate continue to decline within the blood. So then you can say, okay, consumption is higher than production in this case. And I think that's something that gets kind of lost in translation is, it's like, what can we say from blood lactate is exactly what I just said. Whereas I think a lot of people read a little bit too far into it because we don't know where that lactate is going. Lactate can also be taken up by the liver and be converted into glucose in a process called gluconeogenesis. So it can be repackaged as glucose and then shipped back out into the blood as glucose. And then that glucose could go into, your muscle or your brain, or wherever is going to oxidize it. But yeah, we are definitely limited by our ability to even detect how important it is. There are some were you around for the nutritional supplement called Cytomax?
Yes. Oh God, sorry. Yes, and but I didn't like. I don't know any. I remember the name, but I
Yeah.
didn't like study it or
So
anything.
that was made by a really famous lactate researcher. His name is George Brooks, and he's brilliant. If anyone wants to read more about lactate metabolism, start with just Google his name, and probably like maybe 300 papers will pop up all on lactate. He made a drink powder, kind of like all the other stuff we see right now, SIS, Never Second, other things like that. But his wrinkle was that he put glucose, fructose, and lactate into the actual drink mix. And the idea is that because glucose and fructose are taken up by different pathways within the digestive system, you'd be able to maximize the amount of carbohydrates that are going into your blood. And then lactate as well is taken up by a different mechanism. So you could essentially saturate the body, the blood, with all of these carbohydrates that could then be uptaken into the muscle and used. And I've been thinking a lot about this because I've been talking to Robbie Jacobs, who's a co-host on this show, about it. If you told me, or if you told somebody, hey, we're going to make you ingest lactate and it's going to make your performance better, they'd be like, you're crazy. Lactate is going to make me fatigue faster because lactate is fatigue, right? That's what everybody says. No. It's associated with fatigue, but correlation does not equal causation. So if you had elevated lactate values within the blood, you'd actually be able to take that up, and that would start being actually used within your, type 1, like your mitochondria, a lot faster. So it's a third avenue of getting more carbohydrates into your system at any given point. And maybe it actually doesn't work, and that's why the company, I don't think they sell Cytomax anymore. Maybe they got bought by somebody else and it got kind of shelved for a little while. I used it for a bit, and I could take a lot of that with no gastrointestinal issues. So yeah, it's an interesting concept. I don't know if you've ever heard of that idea though.
Yeah, no, so that's the first I had heard of Cytomax, but I did not know that lactate was one of the like fuel ingredients.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say that the theory makes a lot of sense to me.
Right.
But if we're also producing lactate pretty easily, then it's like, is that a necessary ingredient to? And then
Yeah.
it also seems like if it worked, it seems like that would have taken off and we would still be using it today, and we're not.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
I think it comes down to, we're learning more about carbohydrate intake and the trainability of carbohydrate, like with training and nutritional interventions. And it's like, we know that carbohydrate works. And I think that carbohydrate is like, if you're looking at, like a pie chart of importance, like fructose and glucose is probably 80 to 90% of that pie chart. And then things like ketones or lactate or medium chain triglycerides make up a much smaller proportion of their contribution to better performance, right? Because it's just, I think, to some extent, it just gets in the way or is just not used as much. But yeah, so that's what I would say. I saw a really good post the other day from Dan Plews, and he was talking about how a lot of people now are trying to consume 120 grams of carbohydrate during their workouts. And this gets a little bit misconstrued, right? Because we have research. I think what Dan said was really great. He said, we don't have any evidence that 120 actually helps performance. We know that 90 helps performance, but bumping up to 120 may actually hinder your performance because of, kind of what we were talking about. It might make you a one fuel source athlete, which would be really bad. And I think, again, this is where research in coaching, the connection needs to be made. We have these studies that they're just like, oh, we're going to give people 90 grams, 100 grams, 120 grams, and we're going to see what the outcomes are. So people get these outcomes and they're like, oh, well, A, if it was even tolerable, that's like the first step. But then B, and I'm guilty of this, is there are some studies that are like, yeah, people who took in 120 grams of carbohydrates had lower, lower prevalence of inflammation markers following, their event. Like, so lower blood creatine kinase and other things like that. So that would be like, oh, well, maybe the recovery is going to be a little bit easier because you took in a lot of glucose. But nothing is really looked at, say performance or, other things like that. So it's like, it's one of those things, maybe it's a bell curve, right? Where we need to find the optimal amount of carbohydrates that's going to aid in performance. And then there's a drop off that could, then be hindering it eventually.
And see, like my coach brain, so this is interesting, right? Because we're like, you have science brain and then the coach brain, and the science brain is saying there's no evidence to show that more carbohydrates is better. And I'm like, except for the guys that are taking in 120 grams and
Right.
winning
No, I know.
Ironman. So like,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? In my mind, I'm like, there's your evidence.
Yeah. Well, yeah. No, exactly. And that's, again, this is where it's so hard, right? Because it's like, oh, well, as scientists, we want this, like the research. What does the research say? And you're like, well, if you actually look at, the Norwegian guys, they're taking in probably 150 grams of carbs, at least on the bike. And that would, if you suggested that probably like 10 years ago, that would be like, no way, like absolutely no way, that's not going to happen. And so yeah, so it's one of those things. I love that you pointed that out, because that that's not where my brain initially went. And, so, but I do think the bottom line is there's tons of individual variation, and you have to train that sort of stuff over time, because it's, you couldn't just go out. Well, first of all, you're probably not putting out enough power in order for your body to actually oxidize all those carbohydrates. So don't try to be like Christian Blumenfeld and take in 150 grams on a bike if you're only going 15 miles an hour, during an Ironman. Don't try to do that, because your body honestly is probably at a point where 60 to 90 is probably pretty adequate. And then you could probably also, since it's a little bit lower intensity, stand to take in other types of food like fats, right? So yeah, thank you for pointing that out, because it really is, you get really siloed in the science world where you're like, oh, but you have to take in those, they're not anecdotal, but those like N of 1 or 2 as well. And then put your thinking cap on and say, okay, well, let's problem solve here. What is it that's allowing them to take in 150 grams? Is it really that it's Morton, or is it because they've practiced this and because I know the guys, and I've talked to them, and they say they're fueling with carbohydrates every single day during almost every single practice. And I know it's probably variable, but I don't know many people who actually do that and try to like push their carbohydrate tolerance up higher and higher and higher.
Yeah, I don't know anyone that does that either. And I think your point to like, if you're only going 15 miles an hour, like you don't need to do that. I feel like this is why the concept of like fats and carbohydrates and fueling and all is so confusing. And it's because it's so individual. Like if you're a woman who weighs 115 pounds and you're out and you're pushing 120 watts, and that's like your race effort for Ironman, first of all, you're flying because you're little. And so like you don't need to put out the same amount of watts to hit the speeds that the guys who weigh, 170 pounds need to put out higher watts, right? And then that requires more energy. So the bigger you are, the more energy it takes to get your body across the Ironman course, right? So then it makes more sense that like you need to be more fat adapted, because you can still only take so much carbohydrate. But then like your 115-pound woman hears this advice and is like, well, let me try to eat as many carbohydrates. Like, no, not for you. For you, like probably 70 an hour might be fine. And so it's so nuanced, and people need to be able to think critically and logically and as individuals. It's like, understand the big picture concept, and then who am I? How does this apply to me and the event or the goal, that I have? Because am I running a 5K or am I racing an Ironman, right? And they're just, and so it's the same kind of thing about like, training theory and everything. Like there's so much information, and genuinely that might be one of the more challenging things. We talked earlier about how have things changed, like in the decades that I've been involved in the sport. And you would say that like, well, early on, we knew nothing. And so we just like learned by experience. And now it's almost like, oh my God, we know too much. You know what I mean? Like it's too much. And so when somebody comes out with like, their theory or their idea or whatever, they have this scientific study to back it up and prove it. And the thing is like, they're right, but like they're looking specifically at, these untrained, an untrained population of college students, and they did the test for 4 weeks. And you're like, okay, well, how does that apply to, the endurance athlete who is well trained and is going for longevity? You know what I mean? Like, is there anything about that information that applies to our situation here? But yet, like, if there's some, I don't know, magic outcome of that study, and it's like headlines across the world, and they're like, well, that's what we should be doing. I'm like, well, it just doesn't apply to you specifically in this case. And it's just like this overwhelming, I think that's why it's hard for some athletes to pick out like exactly what they should be doing. And it's because there's too much information out there now.
Yeah. I always default to keep it as simple as you possibly can. Right. Focus on the big rocks. And I say this almost every single episode, I feel like, but I always focus on consistency, specificity, and progression. And you can do that with anything, right? consistent sleep, consistent nutrition, specific nutrition, right? Specific training, consistent training, progressive training, those sort of things. So it always comes down to that. And I think we're blessed to be in this world of so much information, because, you know, it's like we wouldn't have been able to even have this conversation. It's been so amazing to actually be able to talk to you and get your perspective on these sort of things. But at the same time, if we're taking in so much data and we don't know what to do with it, then it's just noise. And I think that's what people lose track of, because people are just, you know, they're arguing, oh, is power the best to train by? Is heart rate the best to train by? Is like, well, are you even choosing one? And are you even doing any testing to figure out where your heart rate zones are or anything like that? I don't see that you have. So we need to start first. Let's just choose power. Right. And power is easy to understand, whatever it is. But, you know, or let's just choose heart rate. If you just have a heart rate monitor, let's just do a step test, figure out where your transition points are, modulate those on a given daily basis, and then go from there. You know, keep it simple, because it's really, really easy to get so bogged down in the information. And I'm sure there's people chomping at the bit to, like, you know, be like, oh, Phil, you missed, you know, like you didn't talk about fat oxidation correctly, or, you know, something like that. It's like, okay, fair. I totally admit that I, you know, probably don't get everything 100% right, but I think still at the end of the day, we still need to take a step back and say, okay, how can all of this discussion translate to the general public, to the coaches, to the athletes? And again, it comes down to, like, I've visualized information kind of as like a bit of a pyramid. And at the bottom of that pyramid, and this was said on this podcast, is what becomes practical becomes optimal. And, you know, so if it's not practical for you to have 150 grams of carbohydrate in your bottle, there's no way that's ever going to become optimal for you, because it's such a headache to actually get it done, right? This is one of the reasons why I don't do triathlon. Practical for me is not going to a swimming pool every single day. I just don't really like it. And it's just not for me. But, you know, it's what becomes practical becomes optimal. And that can be said, you know, in so many different aspects of life. And I just want people to walk away as like, hopefully you learned a lot from Michelle and my discussion. And, you know, if there's good, you know, scientific debates that we can have that will move this discussion forward, I am all for it. DM me, shoot me a text, you know, whatever it is. But if we're going to argue just for the sake of syntax arguing, you know, that's not going to get us anywhere. Then that's kind of where I'm like a little bit draw the line of like, well, this isn't furthering, you know, our ability to actually train athletes better.
I think that exercise physiologists argue more than coaches do.
Yeah, no, for sure. Well, that's what academics get into research about, right? Is I mean, I'm not to argue, but to debate, you know, scientific terms, and to, you know, because words matter. Don't get me wrong. Like this is an audio medium, so words do matter. It's just, you know, do we really need to, you know, argue whether or not thresholds exist, because it's not actually a threshold point. It's more of a zone, a threshold zone. No, not really. Like, yeah, we just have to identify that, oh, if you measure fat max versus lactate threshold 1, those are going to be slightly off, because from a physiological perspective, they're slightly different. So yes, that's so funny that you say that. Yeah, I think scientists do debate and argue a lot more than coaches, and I think coaches are more worried on developing the athlete, right? You know, they're like, well, how is this going to make my athlete better? And, you know, you're more, if you're a good coach, you're talking to the individual athlete every day, and you're trying to develop them as an individual, which is, you know, exactly how I think all coaching philosophies should be, is how can I best develop this individual that's in front of me right at this moment to elicit their best performance possible.
Yeah. And you had asked me before something about, you know, what does it take to have longevity in the sport, you know,
Mm-hmm.
to last a long time. And so it's really interesting because, again, like from my coach's viewpoint, I'm listening to, you know, the exercise physiologist and the data, I'm reading all of that. And then at the same time, I have legit evidence and proof that being happy on race day makes you race better,
Mm-hmm.
right? And you're like, I don't know, go figure out the science on that one,
Yeah.
Dr. Phil.
Seems pretty
right?
seems pretty woo-woo to me, Michelle. No,
It's legit though. I mean,
yeah.
it's so interesting that like you can have an athlete that did all the exact right training, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm looking at it going, oh my God, they've nailed it. They've nailed this training cycle. I can't wait for this person to race, and then she gets on the race course and you're like, what happened? And
Mm-hmm.
it's like, well, what happened is that she started racing and she was unhappy about something. And she spent the entire time beating herself up about how like, this isn't enough and it's not good enough, and
Mm-hmm.
all the negative thoughts in her head translate out to a performance that was subpar as compared to what I expected, was going to come out of her. And then I've seen the exact opposite too happen, where here's an athlete that missed some key training days, and you're like, well, good luck in that marathon, like, I
Mm-hmm.
don't know how that's going to go, she's like, we missed out on some things. And then she just is so happy, smiling the whole time, pops off like 20 minutes faster than you thought she was
Yeah.
going to go. And you're like, what just happened? And then you go, you know what, there's more to it than like, so like, I'm not saying the science isn't important. Obviously it is, right? And like, I want to understand that to the best ability that I can and put it in its right place and
Mm-hmm.
know that like that is one piece of the puzzle.
Mm-hmm. I
And the other
100% agree. Is we as physiologists, we really focus on how to make people's physiology better, and sometimes we lose track of the intangibles, right? Being happy on race day, I cannot tell you. I was grinning that entire time you were saying that, because I cannot tell you how many races that I've had where I was happy and I had such a great experience. Like I did an Ironman back in 2012. And I have a picture or my mom took a picture of me riding past one of the viewpoints, and I was just grinning ear to ear because I was just having the best day of my life, and it was so much fun. And I still look back and it was still super fun. It got really hard about 16 miles into the marathon, but it was an amazing day. And I the days that I do have, that like it feels good, and it's just I'm enjoying being out here and all of that. That's what it's all about. And I'm going to leave everybody with that, because I think that is the secret to longevity in a sport, is to put in the hard work, but also enjoy the hell out of it. Because if you don't enjoy it, it's going to be really, really hard to actually continue to do.
100%.
Yeah. So with that, you can always find me if you have questions, want to debate anything or anything like that, at Critical02 on Instagram. Comment down below if you're on YouTube. Michelle, where can people find you?
So I'm at Mama Simmons on Instagram. It's MAMA_Simmons_. And also MichelleSimmonsCoaching.com.
Awesome. Cool. Yeah. Michelle, you're awesome. I hope that this can turn into a couple more conversations that we can have, because, you put a lot of really good things into perspective for me, right? I've been looking at a microscope, and I really think a lot about, like the microscopic picture, and I'm trying to take a step back out into the big picture of things. So all your wisdom that you shared today is much appreciated. And I hope the listeners really appreciate it as well.
Thanks.
Awesome. We'll catch you guys in the next one.